Hey everyone, today we're going to take another look at the Mikawa Nagura lineup, specifically in reference to razor honing. This will have a little bit of overlap with the broader Nagura overview video that I did a few videos back, but there is some information about ensuring success with these Nagura, the contemplation of which ones do you want to use, and how we can use them to make it as easy for ourselves as possible. That I didn't go into that video as in-depth as I could have, and I would like to do that now. I'd like to do that today. So we'll go ahead and still talk a little bit about the background of the Nagura, the lineup that we have here, what you would use when you're honing your razor, and then how that works when we have softer, medium hardness stones, as well as hard to very hard stones, what you should watch out for, or rather maybe just keep in mind when you're going into those different circumstances, and setting yourself up to have a good honing experience on each of these, or maybe decide if you even want or need each of the Nagura or all of the Nagura, depending on the base stone that you'll be using. So, just again, a brief overview as to what the purpose of these Mikawa Nagura are. So we have a lineup from coarse to finest, and these designations were created by a group of people led by a man, Iwasaki-san, and the goal of this was to look at the different strata of these Mikawa Nagura that were available from the Mikawa mountain range, and grade them in a manner that designated what their use would be, how they're going to perform, and allow you to functionally move through a practical progression of them for razor use or otherwise. Now, Nagura in general from that region of Japan had been used for a very long time before Iwasaki took on this task, all the way to the point of the founding of that word Nagura was actually a name of someone who had originally proliferated the use of this white stone from the Mikawa area, and his name got tied to the function of those stones as correcting stones, and that is the origin of the Nagura name. There's a longer version of that on naturalwhetstones.com if you want to know the nitty-gritty. But nonetheless, we have this lineup here. The lineup is not necessary in its entirety for razor honing. As a matter of fact, the entirety of the lineup is not usable for razor honing. At minimum, we would remove Mushi and Ban from the Nagura list for razor honing at minimum. Both of these are far better suited for knife work, being Nagura stones in that regard. We also have Atsu. Atsu, depending on the stone, can go either way. You could use this in the very early stages of razor honing, or you could keep it for knives. If you're not super familiar with different Nagura, how to grade them and test them, it would be better to just leave Atsu a knife pile. So that leaves us with our primary spread of razor graded Nagura, or rather graded Nagura that we would apply for razors. We have Yai Botan and Botan, which are going to perform the same relative task. So really we could look at the lineup like this. These are all different layers that come out of the ground, or that came out of the ground when this was mined, and Yai Botan and Botan are different layers in the earth, but they have very similar makeups, so they get graded as the same relative thing. There are actually also 2 layers of Tenjyo, but they're so similar that they don't get any different designations. Yai Botan and Botan do perform a little different. Yai Botan starts off a little coarser. It just takes a little bit longer to break down, but they do the same relative task. There's no real need to move from Yai Botan to Botan, and there's no need to have Yai Botan before your Botan. So really, you're going to make a choice between either or. By and far, the vast majority of people are going to just choose Botan. That's the classic one, if you want to call it that. So here we have the more traditional lineup of the 4 stones, and we would go Botan at the start, Tenjyo, Mejiro, Koma. That does bring us to the first question of whether or not you need both Koma and Mejiro in the lineup. Sakamoto, more recently, has discussed that he feels Mejiro is equal in fineness or finer than Koma, so that the Koma is unnecessary. And Iwasaki, when he wrote the book covering this topic to begin with, only in passing mentions Koma. He does not talk about the use of it. So its function is theoretically unnecessary, but you'll hear a lot of people talk about it anyway. My experience, which I've used many of these different Nagura now, at these different levels and different gradings, I find that these two perform very similar, and that the Koma tends to be a little faster, and the Mejiro, maybe on average, tends to be a little finer, but that's piece to piece. You can easily get overlap where you have Koma that are finer than Mejiro, or Mejiro that are finer than Koma, depending on the 2 individual pieces that you're comparing. And of course, that's relative to the entire lineup. That, this Tenjyo, though it is Tenjyo, if it's within a range, and not all Tenjyo will be copy-paste of this exact thing, because it's a natural product, it's going to have its own quirks from where it was in the ground compared to other pieces about where those were in the ground. Now that we have our main set out here, and we've talked about the preceding ones, these are really the only ones that you're going to need. The other ones can be fun to have just to explore, but, if you're trying to think about what you want versus what you need, those earlier 4 that we talked about can be left off of the table for timeout for razor honing. Now, the truth of the matter is, it's a valuable question to ask if you even need all 4 of these for razor honing in general. And the general answer to that is going to be a personal answer per person, but I feel fairly confident that I could tell most people no, that you do not need all 4 of these. That more time spent with fewer of these would work probably just as well. Or actually, in my own anecdotal experience, have worked just as well. I think it's important to note that, coming up with this schema of grading across the range, was of interest in using each of the strata that was usable stone from the Mikawa Nagura mine. And, of course, it would be in the best interest of the person selling it to want to say you need each of these steps. However, even, we talk about Iwasaki and Sakamoto, right? They don't even suggest you're going to have your Koma on the list. I find that you could choose probably one of these, and unless if you're making a gigantic jump from a 1K synthetic all the way to your Nagura lineup, one of these would do you just fine. With that said, even if you have a 1K synthetic setup and you jumped to Botan, it's not going to be sufficient to get rid of those scratches without a lot of time on the stone anyway. I have individual videos of bench size version of each of these Nagura, and you can take a look at those, and really there is not a gigantic difference between them. In the synthetic world, we might be talking 500 to 1,000 grit jumps between each of these tops. So maybe you can get a farther range than that if you have a truly amazingly fine Mejiro or Koma, a very coarse Botan, but realistically speaking, the Botan's always going to feel like a 4 to 6,000, maybe 5,000-ish, and your Koma and Mejiro are always going to feel like a 7,000-ish. So there's just not that big of a range between those. Usually you're going to work your razor on either a natural stone or a synthetic stone, either or, equivalent up to about 3 to 5,000. Then you're going to transition to your Nagura. If you're talking about that range, you could just use one of these. Right, you could just pick Mejiro and say, I'm just going to use Mejiro before my final setup on my stone slurry. And that would work very well. I do that far more frequently than all of these 4. Does the 4 offer you maybe more small granularity between it? It's theoretically possible. It is true that this is coarser and this is finer, but Is the value there if you're actually looking at purchasing these? Probably not. I think a lot of people would benefit if they just buy one of them and then see if they can't get really good results. Of course, though, if you want to do like the traditional route, you want to do the way that it's taught, you're going to need at least Botan, Tenjyo, and Mejiro with the common Koma on the market. And just in the zeitgeist of the honing community, that's always added on too. So, since we've covered that, we'll just pick up one here and briefly go over some of the stamps, which, as you can see, they all share some stamps together and some don't. So usually the two stamps you're going to see on any of these Mikawa Nagura that will be shared across all of the marked Nagura are these two on your right side of the screen. This is the Inspected by Asano stamp, which currently Sakamoto has inherited and is still grading them himself. And then this is the Mikawa Sheer Nagura stamp, indicating that it is that type of stone. And then over on the left-hand side here, we have a grading designation. Now there are a couple of different grading designations that are available for these stones. And something that's important to note when you look at these grading designations is that the designations are not actually about the quality of the stone like we might commonly think when we say a grading designation. In this case, they're indicating a visual property of the stone, and they are indicating a structural, literally the shape of the stone. So not structure of the physical, makeup of the stone, but how the stone has been cut. So in this case, we have here a Betsujo stamp. So that's what that's indicating is that this is a white Nagura with a irregular shape. It's not square. And if we look at a similar stamp here, you can see that two of the three kanji are over here, Betsu Daijo, and this is saying that it is a white Nagura with a square uniform shape. Now, there's nothing inherently superior, of course, about a square uniform shape, and when you're talking about these Nagura, there's nothing inherently superior about the white Nagura either. You'll notice in my collection here, the ones that I have available still, are all white versions of the stone. I do find that there's a difference between the Betsujo stone, which are these white ones, and then Tokyo is the striped version of the stone. They perform the same. You look at the razor under a jeweler's loop, they do the same work. If you talk about feel on the blade on your skin afterwards, same work. They do feel different on the stone though, at least in my personal experience. Disclaimer, this is all anecdotal for sure at this point, but I've handled quite a bit of these, and I feel confident in for myself at least, that this is true. I think a lot of people have, agreed after I talk with them about it that they feel the same. Betsujo stone here, frequently the slurry on the stone feels a little thinner, and it, in my opinion, allows you to feel more of what's going on between your blade and the stone itself. The Tokyo, the striped version of these Nagura, I often find has a more silky or cushioned feel to it. From a perspective of just tactile feedback, I actually like the Tokyo stones better. I think that that very silky, smooth cushion feel is actually more enjoyable in just the sense of it. However, I feel it also masks a little bit of what's going on with the blade, where the edge of your blade is touching on the stone and what's going on. So I've always, after testing both of those out in all these different versions and different Tokyo and Betsujo stones, the ones that I've kept at least up to this point have all been Betsujo stone, because I think the white variety offers you that better analysis of what's going on. Take that for what you will. Again, they're both good. They're usually priced about the same. And truth be told, usually you don't even pay that much extra for a square one, and it's not worth it to, the same stone. So alright, we've looked at this stamp. Now let's talk briefly about what actually is the stone doing for you. When we use Nagura, when we use these stones, handheld version, on a bench stone. Now, of course, this is just for demonstration. We'll get into actually using these a little bit. But there's a couple of things to consider when we're using the Nagura. At first, many people who enter into this just feel that the logical conclusion, rubbing this with what is usually billed as a softer stone onto your harder surface, is that you're going to get a transfer of this stone material onto the surface of your base whetstone as slurry. And that makes sense if you think about a grading schema where you go from coarse to medium fine to medium fine or fine. You know, you want to transition that material onto the top and get the benefit of it. Now, that is a little bit of a simplistic view of what these are doing, and it also does not include how the person can control the process. So we're going to talk about that. The first element to consider is that there are two very important things going on here. The first is that, yes, you are transferring, in an ideal world, you're transferring some of this slurry onto the surface of this, but also the natural composition of how coarse or fine this Nagura handheld is conditioning the surface of this stone. It's changing how it is presenting to the blade as well. And if you use a very coarse version of this, and then so let's say we used a mushi, right? If we went to the absolute baseline, and then we used a koma. So if we started with our mushi, we went all over the stone, and then we washed off the stone, any slurry remaining we washed off. The surface itself is actually going to be much more abrasive because it's going to have deeper gouges in it at the microscopic level. You'll feel it doesn't feel as smooth. How that affects the blade of either your razor or your knife, and how that affects the base whetstone's ability to self-release slurry, right? It'll increase what we call the friability of the stone. It'll increase the likelihood that those particles from the base stone itself are dislodged as we rub the blade across it. And it will make forming slurry from the base whetstone easier. But that'll also make it cut faster, and it'll bring more of this stone out in a world where we got the slurry away. Now, if we did the same with koma, we would see the opposite happen because koma is finer than the mushi. Even after we combed this all up over the surface, then washed all the slurry off, we'd find that the surface was smoother, less likely to release its own particles, and performing at a finer level. So even when we take the slurry out of the picture, the stones are automatically impacting how even your base rock is performing on the metal. Now, of course, that's exaggerated even more when we keep the slurry on the top of the stone, because you have either coarser or finer particles that are hovering in the mix and helping to grind under the blade as it moves. However, a large majority of that difference in cutting power does come from how the stone itself is conditioned. This can be even more dramatically done if you want by taking a 140 diamond plate to the surface of a stone, use it. You'll see it self-slurries very easily. It performs as coarse as it possibly can. And then if you use a 1200, which is behind the camera here, it'll be really, really fine compared to that. It won't want to self-slurry as readily. It'll give you that very smooth experience. So those are obviously on like the very dramatic ends of the spectrum, but functionally, our Nagura are doing the same thing. And the type of Nagura that you use is conditioning that stone. That's maybe half of what's going on to the blade, and then the other half is going to be that suspended slurry. Now, the second thing to consider with these, so we've covered the Nagura being conditioned. The Nagura conditioning the surface of the stone. Now, in a similar thought process, the conditioned surface of your base whetstone and your Nagura itself also impacts how you make your slurry. So let's say that we condition the surface of my whetstone here with a 140 grit diamond plate. So it's real friable, it's real scratched up on the surface, and as we move anything over the top of that, it'll want to give up its particles. And then when we're prepping our Koma Nagura, let's say that we conditioned this surface with a 1200 grit. So now, based on that same concept, this is not very friable. It's very smooth. It's not going to want to give up its own abrasive. If we take this Nagura then, wet it, and then we take this stone and wet it and we rub the Nagura on it, you're going to find that the vast majority of the slurry that you're going to make is actually base Whetstone slurry, not Nagura slurry. So that's something to watch out for, because it's not just rubbing the stone, rubbing this on this and saying, oh, this is generally a softer stone, so it's always going to transplant slurry onto your Whetstone. That's not how it works. You have to take into consideration how these things are conditioned together. And of course, there's some benefit to that once you get used to the concept, because you can play around, right? You can make these both conditioned at 140 and get a perfect mix of slurry from this, slurry from that. You can condition, you could do what I said, you could condition this at 1200, this at 140, and play with mostly base Whetstone slurry. You could do, usually what we more popular is the opposite, right? Where you're going to condition the Nagura more coarsely with 140 to 400. You're going to condition your base Whetstone with a 600, 800, or 1200. And then that way you have your Nagura fairly readily giving up its slurry to cover the base Whetstone and just kind of condition that surface a little bit for you. That's going to be the most common way to do it. And that is something I will definitely suggest to everybody is when you're starting out. And if you don't have diamond plates, you can use sandpaper. When you're starting out, condition the surface of your Nagura with a 140 grit diamond plate or 140, 200, 300, whatever grit sandpaper before you start the process, and then let your base Whetstone be conditioned at a higher level. Because that'll really help you get it so that your stone is transitioning that slurry onto the top. The second thing to also discuss is soaking. Is that, of course, if we just spray these stones down real quick, hopefully you might be able to see it, this guy definitely. Stones, of course, naturally suck up the water you put on them. And usually the softer the stone is, the more rapidly it's going to suck the water up. So for instance, this stone here is very hard, it sucks up almost no water. The stone here is very soft, it sucks up quite a bit of water. These two are more in the middle, and we can see that this is slowly sucking up that water. If you have not soaked your Nagura, and you have not soaked your base Whetstone, there's a good chance that you will find that when you go to use the Nagura, it's going to catch. It's going to catch on the stone because it is not properly hydrated, and it's sucking the moisture out of that area and causing a suction onto the stone. You don't want that. It's a really good way to cause damage to your Whetstone, whether it's the Nagura or the base stone itself. You don't want that catching. I feel like there's a term for it, but I'm forgetting it in the moment. So you do want to, at minimum, soak the Nagura. Soak the Nagura for 5 minutes minimum. I would say as long as your Nagura is fully sealed up like this, which they should be, throw it in the drink for 30 minutes before you use it. That'll, if it's conditioned at 140 and it's soaked for 30 minutes and you go to use it, it's going to be a dream to use compared to if we just tried to use this real quick without it being conditioned and without it being soaked. A lot of these stones are old and they're dry, and soaking them brings some of their vitality back, or especially when they're supposed to be a softer stone, which all these Mikawa Nagura are supposed to be softer stones. With that said, if we kind of go back to the concept of conditioning and what happens when you use them together, if alternatively you soaked this stone and you did not soak your Nagura sufficiently, even if this was conditioned at 140 and this was conditioned at 1000, when you go to use this dry stone on this moisturized stone, you're going to find that maybe it won't catch because this is still somewhat friable, but it'll still pull up majority base Whetstone slurry because this is so dry it doesn't really want to give up anything. Generally speaking, my suggestion for everybody when you're going into this process, get all your stones sealed on the sides and the back. Soak your Nagura at least 5 minutes. Up to 30 is totally fine. Not going to hurt anything. And unless if your stone has like a super worrisome crack or something on it, if it's like any of these, just kind of a standard stone, soak the stone for up to 30 minutes as well. If you're a little afraid of that with your stone, or if it has risky things, what you can kind of do is just make a pool like this and then keep the pool hydrated for 5 minutes, which of course you can do this too if you're not sealed on the back or the sides. You could just manage the pool on the top. But most whetstones that have no problem, that have no cracks or anything concerning, are going to be just fine being soaked for 30 minutes. And you'll find that both the base whetstone and the Nagura really come to life and really perform to their best extent if they're soaked and you have taken conditioning of their surface into account. So generally speaking, the way that I would do it is I would take each of the Nagura I would intend to use, which in this case we'll do the classic 4 if you want to think about it like that. I would, before soaking them, I would run them under some water along with my 140 diamond plate. I'm going to condition the surface of each of them so they're pretty rough, and then I'm going to soak them for 30 minutes. These whetstones are conditioned either between 140 or 1200. I tend to keep the softer stones for polishing, ready for polishing, which means they're conditioned at 140. The harder stones I usually leave on that finer side, so they're just refreshed with a 1200 before I store them up. But either or will work. These will ultimately be fairly soft stone. But once we are soaked up for each of these, we will discuss, of course, the last matter, which is how these soft stones are impacted or impact the whole process when you use them with a very soft, somewhat hard, very hard stone, and whether or not, you always want to be at the hard end of things. So I'm going to go ahead and get these, all of these in the water for, again, as we discussed, about 30 minutes. We'll come back, we'll rub some of them on the surface. I'll try to show you what I talked about where it will catch, and that's what you want to avoid. And in the end, we will, of course, use all 4 of them, probably on one of these 2 stones, to hone up this razor here. All right, well, see you when we're done soaking. All right, so it's been 30 minutes. Before we pull everything out from soaking, I did want to cover both. Obviously, you want to condition all the stones the way that you want them before you do the soak. So that's both the Nagura and the base stone. You're going to want to determine how you'd like those to be conditioned and then go ahead and take care of that. But you also want to make sure that both your base stone and your Naguras are chamfered off well. So I have the Botan here, and it's a good example of one that probably needs to have the work done. If you look right here, you can see that even though it has a previous chamfer, it's been lacquered in that area, so it has a sharp edge right here. And as we're working the Nagura on the base stone, we might find that sharp edge, all you need is a little tilt. You could scratch the surface of your stone, or worse. So you always want to make sure that before you use your Nagura, so really even then before you soak them, you chamfer off the edges of your Nagura, and that means you really want to end up with something like these are both not Mikawa Nagura, but they're both chamfered well. You can see we have the clear corner here where the potential areas for it to become real sharp are taken off, and you just do that with your 140 diamond plate. And then, you go against it and up. You always pull away from the lacquer so you don't accidentally pull the lacquer off. So, all right, let's go ahead and get our stones here. As we discussed, we have had each of these soaking, both the handhelds and the base stones. So we're actually going to leave some of these stones still soaking. We're going to pull these out in some order of hardness so that nothing else dries out in the meantime. So okay, this example that we're going to do here is not where most people would start. or rather what most people would look to use, but it is still a viable solution if you really want. This is a 3 out of 5 hardness stone, relatively speaking. It's of course opinionated, but that's, I think, most people are going to feel it's a soft stone. Either way, it's a Hakka Tomae, for what that's worth. And we're not going to probably run the razor too much on this. This is an Awasedo, but it is a very early level Awasedo, so it's a little coarser, but that's really more on the cladding, on a hard core steel. So obviously, like your razor, the whole thing is basically, you know, what we'd call the core steel. It's going to leave a scratchless but fairly hazy finish, so it's still on the coarser end. We have, we're just going to use the Botan here, and you can see again it has been newly chamfered and soaked. And what we will see is, even though all of this is, you know, this has been conditioned to 1200, this has been conditioned at 140, they've both been soaked. What we're going to find as we use the Nagura, though, is that we still get a significant portion of the base stone. So we can see that all of this material being pulled up here is from the base whetstone. And, you know, it's not because this Nagura is overly hard or anything like that, it's because the base whetstone is so soft. So in circumstances like this, this stone is not particularly suitable for the progression. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you couldn't use it. When we say suitable, it means we're not getting the maximum benefit of the stone. However, as we discussed earlier, the surface of the stone is still being conditioned by, in this case, the Botan Nagura. So it still did make it a little bit coarser on the top than the 1200 we had conditioned with before. And we could still, in this case I'm actually going to do it by hand because the stone's a little lopsided, we still could run through the progression. We could do this for a while, we could wash it all off, we could do Tenjyo, we could wash it all off, go to Mejiro, wash it all off, go to Koma. It won't be nearly as effective of a progression because functionally we're still only really using the base stone slurry because our base stone is so soft, it's pulling up very little of the Nagura slurry. However, as we discussed, the Botan and all the other ones would still be conditioning the surface of the stone to a certain level. So in theory, it's still usable. You could still use this progression with this stone, but yeah, you're leaving a lot of the benefit of the slurry from those base stones, you know, off the table. All right. So this stone actually does perform very well. It can finish razors, and it performs even better, kind of actually in a way that we just used it, which is usually prepping a blade before your true final stone. That's usually used a little bit more, though, in a world where you're not using any Nagura. You know, you can realistically use no Nagura. You could use none of these Mikawa Nagura. You could just use your base stones, and those softer Hakka Tomae stones, which kind of perform like a scratchless 6 to 8. Really good for setting you up before the final stones, before your final harder finishing Awasedo that you want to use your razor on. So okay, in this case we now we went through the Hakka Tomae, which was like a 2.5 to 3 out of 5. This is an Aiiwatani Tomae. It is more like in the range of a 4, 3.5 to 4, but probably a harder, not literally hard, sorry, firm 4. This is a very standard hardness for a stone. And it's a stone that will perform better with the Nagura progression. Can do knives, can do razors. It's that kind of like classic all-around stone, which offers you a lot of versatility. So let's go ahead and use our Botan on it now. We can immediately see, though, the color of the stone is tan, so it's going to look a little bit more white, but we're getting a much more appreciable amount of Botan mixed in here. However, I can just tell looking at it, and we can still see on the stone here, that we also have tan in here. We have some of that base stone slurry. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and I can assure you that if we used a diamond plate to pull this up, it would not be this very... almost dropped it. It would not be this very white tan. It would be like a darker tan. As we can see, the color of the stone itself is a dark, a darker tan when wet. So we are getting like a 50-50 mix between the Nagura here and the stone. This can also be good. There's no reason to necessarily avoid this. Of course, you are getting a lot of the stone up front in the use of the Nagura slurry, but there's nothing wrong with that. The stone can potentially increase performance, and of course it's a very fine stone. It's going to be finer than any of the Nagura that you're using. But if you want something that's pure Nagura slurry, this stone is also not delivering that. The Hakka was almost all base stone slurry coming up. This stone, as we had said, is a 50-50 mix about. So I'm guessing, but that seems reasonable. And you're going to get a very silky performance because a lot of that base slurry is present, but the Nagura will still impact its performance to a degree. So in some ways, this is a way to help speed up the base Whetstone while still primarily performing like the base Whetstone itself. This is still not what most people shoot for, because most people want the progression to be front and center, a more standardized process, and they're going to want that harder stone that's primarily pulling slurry off the Nagura. But if you're someone who likes doing polishing, you like doing knife sharpening, maybe tools, you like razors, and you want an all-around stone, something like this can be really ideal because you're still getting the benefit of your Nagura in the mix here. However, you also have a stone that's soft enough to finish a knife really well, to polish with well. You're not pigeonholing yourself into a really hard stone, which might not do a lot of those other things as proficiently. The Hakka stone, of course, can finish the razor, but it's not really going to give you that screaming keen edge, and it's really soft, so it has its own problems where it's starting to lean too heavily into being like an early finisher stone. Now, when we talk about using these Nagura, you can see the example of rubbing it on. If you don't soak the Nagura and condition them as we talk about, that experience can be really much worse. But we've soaked our stones, we've conditioned them appropriately, and this was also conditioned at 1200. This was, of course, conditioned originally at 140, but it had been worn out a little bit from the Hakka. But because we soaked it, it remained soft and nice and pliable. So, a lot of people will talk about slurry consistency and what type of consistency they want. This is about what I shoot for. I've always had it referred to by other people, and I think it's a decent term, like watery milk. A little bit thinner than milk would be on the surface of the stone, but not too much. Like if we really thin it out like this, it'll still work, but we lose some of its feedback and presence. It's real watery, and I prefer it to be a little thicker than this, but this would still do the job if you wanted to. There's no firm rule. It is hard. Of course, we can add so much water that it's functionally worthless because it's, you can see it's not there anymore. It's so diluted. Still having an impact, but we've lost the benefit quite a bit here. And you can even tell, well, I can tell, that the blade is primarily now just working with the base stone. I have very little cushion, I have very little presence of the Nagura slurry anymore, and it's not really playing a major role. The key here, though, is to understand that all the stones are going to be different. All the Nagura are going to be different. All your base stones are going to be different, and you do not have to conform to a rule that anybody anywhere else says. Use thick slurry, see what happens with your razor. Use thin slurry, see what happens. Use this middle thickness. and see what works. You know, I have definitely some Nagura, some stones that I'll lean different ways on as I use the blade. It could be per metal, grind of the blade. You know, there's so many variables going into it. Experimentation is always the answer to your questions. If you want to, oh, what do I do? Or what's the best way? Or what do you recommend? I mean, I can give you my personal opinion. Other people can give you their opinions. But look at how some other people do it. Try variations around it. And as long as you're not doing anything too wacky, you know, like pulling your razor off the stone or something like that, you know, you're not going to hurt your blade. It's all repairable. Just get something that isn't your pride and joy, that you're comfortable with. If it gets an errant scratch here, or it needs to be bevel set again, but you can find vintage, or I'm not a huge fan of using the gold dollars, but you can get those for $5. Play around until you feel a little bit more confident. But even, you know, slurry thickness, easy to test. Just do a couple runs. See what you like. I showed you what I liked, obviously. So, okay, this is our 4 out of 5 stone concept, and we got about that 50-50 mix. That's normally what I would consider, or would think would happen. Of course, if our Botan Nagura there had been particularly soft, there are softer Nagura than the ones we're using today, maybe we would have gotten a more, you know, Botan slurry heavy mix. But I still think for most 4 out of 5 stones, with everything conditioned properly, everything soaked properly, that's about what I would have expected. So, we really take a look at this stone. I'm going to try to show you an example with this dry stone of it catching, and see if we can get that. So, first and foremost, you can see afterwards, even though this stone has been soaking, that it's dried out, this Nagura is drying out the surface of wherever it's touching. It's real not smooth. This is a very soft Nagura, so our likelihood of actually hurting this base stone is very low, but we really don't want to do that. We got no slurry from doing that, and if we kept doing it, we would find that the base stone is more likely to pull up. If we had done it on this softer 4 out of 5, we would have seen, you know, we would see it catches, obviously, that's real hard, and all of this is going to be base stone slurry. Even though this is so soft, it's still pulled up from this stone, because this is not friable at this point, because it is so dry. This will, you know, break off of its compaction first. That's the right way to say it. Anyway, that's the sticking. That's why we soak the stones, keep everything wet. And of course, again, you can keep it wet, spray bottle, whatever, dip in water. And a lot of people, when you see this, won't talk about the soaking. They might just like spray and go. That can work, but you know, if we pull over this unsoaked stone again and I wet it, it kind of works, but it's caught now. See, look at, got twisted off. And because this is so soft, it'll twist off. But a lot, if this was a harder stone, if this was this Tenjyo here, I can promise you it would not pull off like that. It's a, you know, that Tenju's bigger Nagura. It is a harder, by a matter of magnitude, harder Nagura. And you would not get it to separate from the stone so nicely. So, really, you know, if you're not going to soak your base stones, that's fine. Soak your Nagura. It's one of the reasons they're sealed, or should be sealed, and it so amazingly helps their performance. Don't skip it. All right. So now we're on to a different Aiiwatani stone. This is a Senmai stone. They're not a truly rare strata, but they're much less commonly seen. They're always very thin. This is about the thickness for this mine of the whole Senmai layer. And they're real interesting stones. They exist between the Tenjyo Suita and the Tomae strata. They're a mix of the two in a manner of speaking, but they're usually very on the, well, not very hard, but on the harder side, on the finer side, and this one is no exception. This is about a 4.5 to a 5 stone, and it works very well. It's one of, for my personal use outside of videos, I use this very frequently for my razors. It's, if anything, it might be one of my go-tos, truly. So let's go ahead and use our Botan on it. Now actually this is a good example. So this Botan has been somewhat exhausted, and that's about the level of performance we're seeing with an exhausted Botan, which wasn't too much of a true labor, but it took a little bit of work. What I'm going to do just for the example of the video is I'm going to condition the surface of this Botan with a 140 diamond plate. I'm going to wash off that slurry, and then we're going to try again. And I mean, we're definitely getting more slurry faster. I don't necessarily know how amazingly dramatic of a difference that this is, but I would say, at least in person, it definitely goes faster. And we've also worked a little into the stone now from it being soaked, so it would go even faster again if it was that brand new 140 soaked surface. But we have enough here, probably. And we can just see from the color that this combination, now that we've hit this 4 out of 5 range, is much better. This stone comes up not nearly this white. It comes up like a blue color, and we can see this is a very white slurry we have almost only from the Botan. I'm sure it's not purely from the Botan, but it feels different than the 4 stone. I mean, without the experience, this statement doesn't make any sense, but it feels like Mikawa slurry. It looks the part, and we've now hit the stage where this is going to be much more of like a razor-oriented stone because of its hardness and how it performs with the Nagura. The 4.5 to 5 stones aren't so hard that we couldn't use this well with a knife. This stone in particular does not really enjoy being a polishing stone, and most 4.5 to 5 stones can be polishing stones if you condition the surface well and you have a very steady hand and a very good technique, but they don't tend to lend themselves to it. It's very rare that you get a 4.5 or 5 stone that is also a easy and comfortable polisher. You can make them work, but you feel like you're fighting its nature. However, 4.5 or a lower 5 density stone works really well with knives. You can sharpen with those very well. You get a very keen edge if you're going for like a sashimi type knife, and you are less likely to roll the edge than a true hard 5 or 5+ stone. You can see this is actually a fairly fast stone and slurry combo. Our slurry has changed to a darker gray, and that's not because, excuse me, that's not from the stone kicking up, even though I said it comes up gray. It is from the slow cutting of our base metal. So it's not blazing fast, but we can see that we're making a difference. And that is a really good sign as you see that slurry darken, which of course, even if this was a striped, it would usually be like orange. That'll darken up too. And as it darkens, it'll probably give you an idea that, hey, you might be somewhat ready to progress on to the next step. So I'll try to work this until I would think that we would be on to the next step. But we do have one more stone to take a look at, so I will not be only finishing on this. Now for pressure, I'm not just using the weight of the razor. Often if you use only the weight of the razor, you can sometimes lift up like that, and you don't want that. I also am not pressing really hard. It's a pressure that ensures confidence that the razor is on the stone, but not significantly more than that. And that's about the pressure I use for the whole thing. I do put a little bit more in the early stages, and by the end, I'm just above the gravity, just a tiny bit. You never want to just almost let go of the razor, because then you can't be sure that your blade is firmly contacted. A lot of the skill when people come to talk about this, your razor's keeping its angle. It's about making sure your razor is keeping consistent blade contact with the stone and not applying too much pressure to get that done. As you can see, I just do straight strokes here. I know some people will do X strokes like this. And that does have a benefit. If your blade has a smile, which this one does not, it's flat. But if the blade has a smile, you may find that or a warp, a small warp, you may find that it won't touch the blade. Whereas you can see this blade is perfectly touching the stone by the contact it's tracing in it. If it wasn't, the benefit of this off the edge is that as we move, different parts of the blade can contact the stone. You can get around that warp or that smile. None of my blades, I don't like smiling razors. And we can see this is now getting kind of thick. So I'll just give it a spray. Get us back to that watery milk. None of mine have smiles, so I just do the straight pull method. You can do a little bit of these if you want. I tend to do that earlier in the process. I don't like it when I'm later in it. So anyway, we can definitely see, look at this color change now. And, you know, it is turning tan because the bits are rusting. Some stones will do that a little faster than others. The particles off of this blade are starting to oxidize. But that's okay. That shows us that we've removed a decent amount of metal. And at this point, I would be considering to move on to the next Nagura. There's also feedback that you can feel when you're using the blade on the stone. The feedback is definitely a viable way to also determine if you are ready to move on. However, it's not a very useful way to determine if you are early in the process of figuring out how to do all of this. To me, trying to help someone learn how to use stones and Nagura and telling them, you know, you can just use the feedback. You can tell under the blade when it's ready. That's kind of like saying to someone, hey, you know, you're starting to learn how to bake. How do you know when to pull something out of the oven? You can just smell when it's done. Like, by the time you learn how something smells, it means you've done it multiple times. So I would look for the color change. The color change tends to tell you you're not looking for it to turn like metallic gray swarf. You're just looking for it to go from a bright, whatever its bright original color is, to a more muted gray mixed into that. Probably good. If you're just starting out, I would definitely suggest a loop. You can look at your scratches, and that'll also help you learn a lot when you're ready to go. And over time, right, kind of again going back to that smell analogy, you'll get an idea of what feels right and what looks right when you have the experience to call back. In the beginning, though, you're not going to know that, so you have to look for other things like color. If you are having even a hard time with color, 150 strokes, you'll be good. I mean, that sounds a little ridiculous, and I don't think that's the optimal way to do it. That's kind of ignoring the feedback of the stone and the blade, but 150, 200 strokes per Nagura is going to be probably more than you need, and as such, it'll get you to where you're going. And then again, you can learn every time. So there's a couple different methods you could apply. I suggest looking at the Slurry color change. If you are lost on that, do 200 strokes and then work backwards from there and see if you really need that much, because you probably don't. All right, anyway. So we are now on to our last stone to take a look at. This is a 5+ stone. It's the second hardest stone I've ever handled, and the second hardest stone in my collection. It is a Nakayama Sagi, and it is a, like I said, super hard stone. We're gonna get no mix of this. That 4 out of 5, maybe we had like 15, 20% of the base stone still coming up. We just couldn't see it very much anymore. This is gonna be all the Nagura that we're holding being transferred onto this. And even this Tenjyo is actually the hardest of the Nagura to show today. It's going to be all what comes off because the base stone is so hard. It always seems like when you're jumping into things at first glance, you would want one of these really hard stones, right? I want pure Nagura slurry, but it has some complications. You can see this is not as enjoyable of an experience because it's bobbling all around. The stone is so hard, it's not giving, and it's causing some bouncing, so you really got to hold it down. It's not as nice to work with, but this is a minor inconvenience, all things considered. And also, if you are someone who wants to stick with natural stone only, so you don't want to use a diamond plate or anything to generate this slurry, and it's going to be really hard to find yourself a good Tomoe Nagura to pull up the base stone, because the thing is so dang hard. But we're talking about Mikawa Nagura, so that's beyond the pale. Alright, so as we can see, this stone again comes up a dark blue, and that is even more pure white than what we were dealing with the Senmai. Makes sense because it's such a hard stone. You can even hear 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5, 4.5, 5 plus. You can hear that difference. Of course, you probably don't have the luxury to do that on stones when you look at them. Well, but you maybe even could have someone send you a video. So this is a super glassy stone because it's so hard. We're definitely getting absolutely pure. The only thing I can feel is the Nagura because it's so hard and glassy. But a lot of people really like these. You know, if you're only using razors, that's all you're looking for. A super hard stone like this could be good. Just remember that you're going to have to figure out something for that post-Mikawa stage Tomoe Nagura. But you can get a 4 out of 5 Nagura from a very fine stone, and that would work because your base stone is so hard. It would pull off primarily, of course, similar to this Nagura slurry. Or you can use a diamond plate, which is what I would do. I'd use a 1200 diamond plate on this after all of my Mikawa. One disbenefit of these super hard stones, though, is they're slow because you're relying only on the slurry to do its magic. The stone itself didn't get nearly as conditioned by the handheld Nagura, so it doesn't have the same fast cutting. It's very nice. It's going to be super fine by the end of it, but you're going to be here for longer. You're going to find your slurry changes color slower. So if you go this route, you go with the Mikawa Nagura on the 5+ stone, just take that into consideration. You're gonna be doing more laps, but you know, you're shooting for that super ridiculous fine keen edge at the end, and that's the price you pay, kind of like if you used an Arkansas or something else as well. So it might be harder to see on the camera, but we are starting to see the color of the slurry shift. It is not nearly as like brilliantly white as it once was. And this is kind of what I was talking about before, is we're only on Tenjyo, but the truth of the matter is that between the Botan run on the Senmai and that Tenjyo run right there, that's even better to see the color change. Just is not nearly as white. We can move on to Mejiro, and we can move on to Koma, or we can just not do it. We could just save ourselves the trouble. If you look right here on this blade, right up here, you'll see we already have that finish that most people are looking to get. Hopefully I can get it here. It's kind of difficult to see. You're looking on the spine. So it's already that sandblasted, basically scratchless finish. I mean, I can't see a scratch from here. Maybe under a loop I might be able to pick some out, but it is definitely ready to move on to the final Awasedo step. Is it going to be further refined if we keep going? Sure. It'll be like moving, you know, from, I don't know, a 650 to a 6,500 to a 7,000 to a 7,500 or something, right before we finish up and then move on to our final step. But on that note, we're going to have a final step. right? We're not going to stop with just Mejiro or Koma. We're going to move on to a Tomo phase, whether it is with a Tomo Nagura or a diamond plate. We're going to have something that comes after the Koma. And as such, you know, you're going to impact the final polish with that final stage. You're going to impact the teeth at the edge of the blade with that final stage. How set up it is beforehand matters in the capacity that you have gotten rid of the scratches before, and that there is no scratch leading into the apex of the blade that hasn't been removed. Because if there is, then your final step won't be fast cutting enough or aggressive enough to fix that problem. However, while this is not under a loop when we looked at it, under a loop, this is going to be, I just know it. You can just see it from that polish. I can see it by default just looking at it. Because, I mean, I've done this before, but if we do look under a loop, you guys aren't going to be able to see. But, yeah, we are going to have no apex scratches. And we are ready to go. We're ready to go to the final step. So we're still going to take a look at the Mejiro and Koma. But here's kind of what I was talking about, where if I had just started at Mejiro, if I just done this instead of our Botan and instead of our Tenjyo, would it have taken me a little bit longer? Yeah, I mean, probably all the strokes I've done so far plus 20 or something. However, that's actually probably less cumulative time because I've had to wash this thing off, reapply Slurry for 2 other stones. You know, I could have just stayed with this. I could have been working the Slurry I put up here with just the Mejiro. I could own less Nagura. You know, I could dedicate myself to a really nice Mejiro or something like that, or a really nice Koma and just use that guy. I know that's probably not a super popular take on these stones. Everybody wants to use the progression. That's how Iwasaki taught it. And don't be wrong, it works. Like, there's no doubt that this... 1 second here, let me just try to fix the camera. Alright, I can't see the self-display, so hopefully that didn't mess anything up. There's no doubt that the 4-step process works. It works real well. I think it tends to be super sufficient overkill. So sorry if the video seems like it cut out there. The camera ran out of battery. So I'm going to do a little bit of a restart. Just get the Mejiro Slurry back on there. But as I was going into it that time, so the 4-step Nagura progression definitely works well, and it does give very good results. There's no doubt about that. However, I think if you take a lot of the core tenets from the 4-step progression and follow those same instructions, but rather than doing all 4 of the Nagura, you pick one Nagura and do it with that, you'll find it gives you exceptionally good results as well. That way you don't need to have all these different steps and all these different Nagura. Of course, if you like it and this is fun and you just enjoy the different steps and having the different stones, well, there's no reason you can't go with this option. But I think pragmatically speaking, it probably falls into the not entirely necessary camp. So realistically, you could get Mejiro or Koma and follow probably like the progression suggestions that Iwasaki gives in his book, which would be, you know, he gives both pressure progressions as well as how long he recommends you stay on those different stones. And he basically says with moderate pressure on Botan, something like, I think it's like 3 to 5 minutes. Let's see, I may have noted it down here. No, I didn't. So yeah, I think it's 3 to 4 minutes on that. And then moving up to Tenjyo, he says, I think like 5 minutes on that one. And then with Botan, it's moderate pressure. With Tenjyo, it's lighter pressure. And then Mejiro is, or Tomo, I think he calls it the same stage in his book, is going to be even longer, 5 or 6 minutes with even lighter pressure. he suggests to use a pasted hone, and I don't use that at all. And then hit the actual finishing stage of things for as necessary, probably like up to 10 minutes. So realistically, you're talking about, I don't know, a total of 10 to 15 minutes of Nagura work with varying stages of pressure. If you simplify that down and say 5 minutes with moderate pressure, which again, we're not talking about wrenching, but just on the stone with a little bit of extra force. If you did 5 minutes of that with Mejiro or Koma, then you lightened it up, and then 5 minutes of that still on Mejiro or Koma, and then you did not quite just the weight of the razor, but just a tad above it. For 5 minutes, Mejiro Koma, you're going to find that you're ready to go. You're ready to go into your finishing step, whether you went through Botan, Tenjyo, Mejiro, Koma, or whether you just grabbed a Koma and did the whole time. I guess maybe the only argument against doing that for Koma is that Koma is expensive, comparatively speaking, so maybe you could say you save money by going with Botan and Mejiro. I find that hard to believe. Those handheld Naguras really last you. Doing this should last you for the rest of your life. So you get a good-sized Koma and be done with it. That's kind of my feeling. And that's exactly what I'm doing, is that this progression will get sold off, and then I'll keep my favorite 1 or 2 pieces of Koma. And if I want to use a Nagura method rather than pulling up base slurry or using different bench stones, I would just go to that. However, again, if you do find this fun, the option is definitely there. So I'm not sure how much I lost on the previous video, or the previous take, when the camera died, but as you can see here, our color change has happened with the Mejiro. It's not nearly as white as it was, and it's starting to turn that tan color. And it turns that tan color because it has small bits of metal in it that are starting to oxidize. So that shows us that we are ready to move on to the next step, and in this case, with our progression, it will be the final step of Koma. And, yeah, I mean, hopefully you guys feel that there's enough options here for you to start exploring the topic with some levels of success, right? Again, you can go off of that color. The color shift of the slurry is my favorite method for beginners to use. You could go off of laps, which again, shooting for 100 plus will likely get you done each stage. You could do minutes, as we covered before, as Iwasaki said. You could do 3 to 4 with Botan, 4 to 5 with Tenjyo, 5 to 6 with Mejiro, or you can do it all with one just style of Nagura, Koma, let's say, and just do moderate pressure for 3 minutes to 5 minutes, back off the pressure for another 5 minutes, finish with very light pressure for 5 minutes, and then at that stage you should be ready to move into your Tomo or your diamond plate slurry from the base stone, whatever method you're going to employ. At that point you'll be ready. Obviously I think I've said it this time, but I'll say it one last time. I don't think moving through the different stones is all that necessary. What I will say though is that if I was going to one stone it, just one Nagura it, usually one stone is a different thing, right, where you're just using the base stone. So if I was going to have one Nagura and forgo the progression, I would lean towards a Mejiro or a Koma. I think they cut fast enough. Whatever prep you do that would have prepared you for Botan will likely just as well prepare you for Mejiro or Koma, and you are not missing out on any of that fineness. Some Botans can be a little coarser, and you might feel like you're missing out a little bit. And Tenjyo is a good option as well. They're cheaper, so that has that going for it. But I tend to just feel like at that point, might as well just jump into the Mejiro or Koma, because it's got the speed, more like a Tenjyo, but the fineness more like a Mejiro. there is quite a bit of difference, even Koma to Koma or Mejiro to Mejiro. So, I mean, in reality, I still think looking back, I would end up going. Let's say I wanted to do this with Koma. I've owned quite a few Koma at this point, trade or otherwise, and I've landed on the one I will keep is my favorite one. There could be value in getting 2 to 3 different Koma, get a striped, get a not striped, get the ones that look different, or people say are different, soft, hard. Try them out. You could easily find your favorite, and then sell the other 2. They keep their value pretty well. As long as you're not looking to do it in a hurry, you'll get your money back. So that's a really viable option too. That way you can pick the one that you like the feel of the best, or whatever, cutting speed, etc. And we are starting to see the color change now. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean we're done. To me, I would keep going. I can feel the feedback. But once again, if you have no reference point for that feedback, it can be really hard to tell. The color change at least is a signifier. It tells you you're getting close. You can go from there. So when you're looking for these Nagura, there's a lot of places you can get them. There's many vendors that sell them. My personal suggestion is through a service called Buyee, B-U-Y-E-E. You can buy auctions that are sold in Japan via Yahoo Auctions, which is their more popular service, kind of like eBay for many other countries. And Sakamoto, who again stamps, he's the one who currently owns all of the old stock, and he's the one who stamps the Asano markings on the modern Nagura. He'll sell Nagura directly, so you're getting it straight from the source. Everybody else who's selling Nagura is either selling old Nagura that's in secondhand market, or they're selling Nagura, more likely they've bought them from Sakamoto via the exact same method. This Nagura will be a lot cheaper than other options, by usually an order of magnitude, especially Koma. Koma will be significantly more affordable through him than any other place. Some places are insane. They're trying to charge $400 for just 4 medium to small sized handheld Nagura. Should never be that way. You can get them for much better priced from Sakamoto. They're authentic. And I would do it that way. Some people put a lot of clout, I guess, or emphasis on a matching set, having someone vet the set for them. It's up to you. I think a lot of them go really well together. And there's something to be said that you can find stones that work better, right? Obviously, you can find a finer Koma and a coarser Botan, and you can get a wider range, or you can get a lot of fine ones and get a more compact range if that's what you like. It's really up to you in that regard, and that's why I don't think the curated collections are all that important. A, because obviously I don't think you need all of them, and B, you don't know that person's interests or the way that they want their Nagura progression to work line up with your own. I think you have just as likely of a shot of getting stones that you like through buying them separately from Sakamoto as you do buying a curated pile, but totally up to you. So you can see we've got our final color change. I'm happy with the way the blade feels. And to try, I guess, to put the blade feel into perspective for each of these steps, and I'll try to reference maybe some other experience you have. If you've ever sanded anything, wood or whatever, there's a certain point as you're sanding where you can feel that the friction between the surface of what you're sanding and the sandpaper start matching up. There doesn't feel like a disconnect between the two. They both are giving off similar feedback, and the friction lessens or becomes different, easier, I guess it might be a way. That's kind of what you're looking for in the blade. But it's so minor that unless if you have a lot of time on the stone, a lot of muscle memory, so you can notice, let's say, a 5% shift in feel, you're going to want to start off looking for color, counting laps, something like that. So we can go ahead and just, for the sake of comparison, we can take a look at how the spine polish looks after our Mejiro and Koma step. And again, we have that scratchless, nice, polished, sandblasted look here. And we wouldn't finish here, Koma is, or Mejiro or not. You probably could shave off of it, but most people are going to want another step where you would use, again, a Tomo Nagura. You would use a Diamond Nagura, which they're playing the same role, right? Just Tomo Nagura is going to transplant some slurry from the Nagura onto the stone, versus a Diamond Nagura is going to just pull up base stone. The Diamond Nagura will be much faster and way better, much faster in that sense, better at pulling it up for these super hard 5+ stones, but you do always risk having the diamond come off into the surface of the stone. That happens on very worn out diamond plates. I would say, I wouldn't personally be worried using this to generate slurry and use the razor anytime. But you don't want to just press down real hard. You go slow and you let the diamond plate do its work. That way, it's not going to break any of the diamonds off. When you get brand new diamond plates, wear them in on something that you're not going to use immediately, and then wash off the plate, wash off that thing, just so if there's any loose diamonds that come off. But usually after those two things, you're pretty set, and I've not found it to cause any serious issue, especially with honing. It's more likely, in my opinion, to come up every once in a blue moon when you're polishing, because there's just less likelihood that if a rare diamond does come off, it's not pushed out of the way. Versus, I think for razors, they have a good chance of pushing the diamond out of the way as they're going across. Anyway, your mileage may vary. It's always good to take that into consideration. And the natural Nagura Tomo will, or whatever, even these guys, have of course, they're safer in that regard. They'll have nothing that comes off that's bad. So we covered the standard progression, right? Botan, Tenjyo, Mejiro, Koma. I definitely lean towards this side of the plate, though I think Tenjyo can also be really enjoyable to use. Botan and Tenjyo are good also finishing knife slurries. And then you have your earlier ones, Atsu, Ban, and Mushi, which are more focused towards knife or tool work. But now you have hopefully a better understanding of how to get your base stone prepared, how to prepare your Nagura. Soaking them is essential, and getting them to perform in different ways, which allow you to explore what you might like. Because what I like or what everybody else likes might not be what you like. So the best thing that you can do is get one of them. Get one that you're confident will perform like you want, whether you feel more strongly towards this or that side of things. And then from there, test, right? Condition differently, soak differently, condition both the Nagura and the base stone differently. See what you can get, see the mileage you can get out of that Nagura, and then from there you can start making informed decisions about what you think you might like. If you do choose to go with the 4 standard set, right, it's still not a bad choice. Just understand that I think it's pretty natural for people who jump into it to want that certainty of progression, and then find that a lot of these don't end up getting used. They start just picking the one that they like the most and going with that before their finisher, which is natural too, not necessarily bad. Well, if you liked what you saw, like, comment, subscribe, all that normal YouTube stuff, and till next time. Thanks.